My name is Johannes Satella. I am the coordinator of the Africa Research and Impact Network, in short known as ARIN. So ARIN is a network of researchers across Africa that also brings in policymakers across the continent to be able to discuss the research priorities and agendas for the continent, and more specifically, how our research can really be relevant and be responsive to some of the problems that we face, such as the coronavirus and others, and also look at how research can actually inform development in this continent. We have seen that at this particular time, the whole world is at a standstill, and everybody is just hoping on research to be able to bring up solutions that could help to contain the coronavirus pandemic. Vaccines, frameworks for response, all the other things that are needed to support the response to COVID-19 is largely dependent on research and what I would also call innovation. So this is very important to note that research in our lives, research in our society, research in our aspirations is very, very critical. And this is a lesson that Africa as a continent, and indeed the whole world, should take seriously during this particular time. So in our last week's review, we tried to focus on how the continent's policy setting is responding to the coronavirus pandemic. More specifically, we looked at how the local government, especially the local authorities, for instance, in Kenya, we have county governments, and how these local authorities and county governments are able to enhance effectiveness in the war or in the fight against the pandemic. So we identified 4 key points which are very critical and are useful in terms of pursuing additional efforts in the fight against the pandemic. Number 1 is that local communities are actually more exposed to the coronavirus pandemic. Why? Because these communities are already, even before the coronavirus, these communities were already facing really very serious challenges that relate to poverty, challenges that relate to lack of useful amenities that could support livelihoods, lack of access to water, lack of access to good nutrition, lack of access to good healthcare. So with the pandemic coming in, and there is required behavior change that basically depend on some of these things that are lacking within these settings, what it means is that these communities are already now suffering what I would call double exposure. And so this should be taken into account in our efforts to basically respond to the COVID-19 situation. Number 2 is that responding to the COVID-19 situation would require what I would call the people-centered policies. And local governments and county governments are critical platforms that could help to support these people-centered policies. So people-centered policies are policies that really speak to the needs of the people, are policies that takes into account the vulnerabilities and the circumstances within which people live. And these people-centered policies would be much more effective to support response to pandemics such as COVID-19, because then people's aspirations, people's needs are already taken into account. Unfortunately for Africa, what we are seeing currently is that a lot of the response mechanisms depend more on emergency directives. So this shows you that we do not, even within the existing policies, we do not have proper policy frameworks that could help us fight some of these pandemics now and in the future. And what that tells us is that we need to rethink the way our policies are set. Last but not least, it is important to know that the COVID-19 could have some long-term impacts on the livelihoods and the social networks of communities of Africa. So it will be important to really understand what these impacts would look like and be able to integrate these in the post-COVID-19 reconstruction period so that the communities and the governments and all the actors and stakeholders who are affected by this pandemic are able really to recover and reconstruct their livelihoods and their economies in ways that do not degenerate into long-term negative impacts. In conclusion, we did emphasize that there's need for African governments to really focus on developing or rethinking their policy processes and develop policies that are people-centered, policies that are relevant and can be able to help respond to the problems that we may face now and in the future. So what this means is that policies should not just be about documents for the sake of it, but they should be usable documents. Thank you very much. In our next week's review, we will focus on the role of non-state actors. As we know, the fight against COVID-19 is a collective process. It is not just a government role. So there are many non-state actors who could play a role, and how they have done this should be well understood so that that kind of collective action can be integrated and strengthened. Thank you very much, and hope to see you again next week.